The summer of 1851 arrived in Charleston County like a fever no one could shake. The air hung thick and wet over the McAllister plantation, clinging to skin like a second layer of clothing. Magnolias bloomed along the dirt road leading up to the big house, a sprawling white mansion with columns that reached toward the sky, as if trying to touch something holier than the ground it stood on. Inside that house lived Eleanor McAllister, though lived might have been too generous a word. She existed there. She moved through its halls like a ghost in silk, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished hardwood floors. At 38 years old, she had perfected the art of being seen but never noticed, heard but never listened to. Her husband, Thomas McAllister, was a different story entirely. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Thomas was a mountain of a man. 6 feet 3 inches of Southern pride, bourbon-soaked rage, and Old Testament conviction. His voice could carry across 3 tobacco fields when he wanted it to, and he wanted it too often. The enslaved men and women who worked his land knew the sound of his boots on gravel, the crack of his whip against air before it found flesh, the particular timbre of his voice when he quoted scripture to justify his cruelty. "Servants, obey your masters," he would bellow, his face red from drink and heat. Ephesians chapter 6. The good book don't lie. Eleanor had heard that verse so many times, it had lost all meaning. She sat at the breakfast table that Monday morning in July, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the pattern of her untouched eggs. Across from her, Thomas shoveled food into his mouth between gulps of black coffee and complaints about the tobacco crop. "Yields down again," he muttered, not looking at her. "Those lazy bastards in the Westfield aren't pulling their weight. Might need to remind them what happens when they slack off." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned long ago that Thomas didn't want conversation. He wanted an audience. "You listening to me, woman?" "Yes, Thomas." Her voice was soft, carefully measured. The voice of someone who had learned to make herself small. He grunted, satisfied, and returned to his plate. Through the window behind him, Eleanor could see the fields stretching out toward the river, rows and rows of tobacco plants baking under the relentless sun, and moving between those rows, bent and glistening with sweat, were the people Thomas owned. 53 souls. She knew the number by heart, 53 human beings whose lives belonged to the man sitting across from her, chewing with his mouth open. The morning continued as every morning did. Thomas finished his meal, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood. He didn't say goodbye. He never did. He simply walked out, his boots heavy on the porch, his voice already rising as he shouted orders at the overseer. Eleanor remained at the table for a long time after he left, staring at her cold eggs, listening to the sound of his voice fade into the distance. The house staff moved around her like water around a stone, careful, quiet, never looking directly at her. They knew better than anyone what happened behind closed doors. That afternoon, Eleanor took her usual walk through the rose garden. It was her only freedom, this brief window of time when Thomas was occupied with the fields, and she could move without his eyes on her. The roses were her mother's legacy, the only thing Eleanor had brought to this marriage besides her name and her dowry. She tended them herself, refusing to let anyone else touch them. She was cutting dead blooms when she heard the voices. They came from the direction of the slave quarters, a cluster of rough wooden cabins beyond the main grounds, hidden behind a line of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Eleanor paused, her shears mid-snip, listening. It was unusual to hear conversation during working hours. Thomas didn't tolerate idleness. Curiosity pulled at her, a feeling so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it. She set down her basket and moved toward the sound, staying close to the tree line where the shadows were thick. 2 women stood near one of the cabins, their heads bent close together. Eleanor recognized them both. Dinah, who worked in the kitchen, and Ruth, a field hand with a baby barely 6 months old. As Eleanor drew closer, staying hidden, she caught fragments of their conversation. "Can't keep hiding him forever." That was Dinah's voice, urgent and low. "What choice I got?" Ruth's voice cracked. "You know what Massa would do if he found out. That boy got his eyes, Ruth. Anybody with sense can see it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The shears slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a soft thud. Both women spun toward the sound, their faces draining of color when they saw her standing there. For a moment no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The cicadas went silent, the wind died, even the distant sound of fieldwork seemed to fade. "Mrs. McAllister," Dinah started, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop her. "Show me," Eleanor said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like someone else's voice coming out of her mouth, someone harder, someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, please, show me." Ruth's hands were shaking as she pushed open the door to her cabin. The inside was dim and stifling hot, barely furnished, a straw mattress on the floor, a crude table, a few cooking implements. And in the corner, in a basket lined with rags, a baby boy slept. Eleanor moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked down at the child, and the world tilted. The baby had Thomas's eyes, that particular shade of grey-blue that ran in his family that he was so proud of. The same eyes staring out from the portrait of his father that hung in the study. The same eyes that had looked at Eleanor on their wedding day and promised to honor and cherish her. "How old?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. She had done the math in her head the moment she saw his face. 7 months, Mom," Ruth whispered. 7 months. Which meant Thomas had been with Ruth in November, while Eleanor lay recovering from her 3rd miscarriage, the one that had nearly killed her, the one that had finally convinced the doctor she would never carry a child to term. Eleanor had spent that winter in bed, her body broken, her dreams of motherhood dying one painful day at a time. And Thomas had spent it creating a child with someone he owned. The room seemed to spin. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her knuckles white. For 20 years, she had swallowed every humiliation, every bruise, every cruel word. She had made herself silent and small and obedient because that was what wives did. That was what her mother had taught her. That was what the Bible said, what society demanded, what every woman in her position accepted as the price of security. But this was different. This wasn't just infidelity. Thomas could have discreetly kept a mistress in Charleston like half the planters she knew. This was ownership. This was taking a woman who had no choice, no voice, no escape, and using her body to create the child Eleanor would never have. Something cracked inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper, something structural, a support beam that had been holding up the entire architecture of who she was. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "What's his name?" Ruth looked up, surprised by the question. "Haven't named him yet, Mom? Didn't seem safe." Eleanor nodded slowly. She looked at the baby one more time. This child who existed because of her husband's cruelty, because of a system built on breaking human beings into pieces and calling it property. "Keep him hidden," Eleanor said. "Don't let Thomas see him. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor walked out of that cabin and into the blinding afternoon sun. She made it all the way to the rose garden before her legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the dirt, still wearing her pristine white dress, and something escaped her throat that was neither sob nor scream, but something in between. No one came to help her. The house staff had learned to ignore the sounds of pain that came from the McAllister plantation. That night at dinner, Thomas talked about tobacco prices and politics and the weather. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her face a perfect mask of wifely attention. But inside, behind her calm brown eyes, something new had taken root. Something patient, something cold, something that would wait for exactly the right moment to bloom. August arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing heat so oppressive it felt like punishment from above. The air shimmered over the fields, creating mirages that made the enslaved workers look like they were moving through water. Inside the big house, even with all the windows open and the fans turning constantly, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Thomas McAllister spent his days riding between the fields on his black stallion, his face growing redder with each passing week. He drove the workers harder as the temperature climbed, convinced that the heat was making them lazy. The whip cracked more frequently. The punishments grew harsher. Eleanor watched from her window, her face expressionless. She had become an observer of her own life in the weeks since discovering Ruth's baby. She moved through her daily routines, breakfast with Thomas, managing the household staff, tending her roses, sitting silently through dinner. But some essential part of her had detached. She was watching herself play the role of Eleanor McAllister, wife, and finding the performance increasingly absurd. At night, when Thomas's snoring filled their bedroom, she lay awake staring at the canopy above their bed. She thought about Ruth, about the baby with Thomas's eyes, about the 53 people whose entire existence depended on the whims of the man sleeping beside her. She thought about her own powerlessness, how she had been traded from her father's house to her husband's like a piece of furniture, how her body had been used and broken in the service of providing an heir she would never produce. The anger that had cracked open in her that day in Ruth's cabin grew roots, spreading through her like kudzu, but she showed nothing. She had spent 20 years perfecting her mask. She could wear it a little longer. The fever came on a Thursday. Thomas had spent the morning in the south field, arguing with the overseer about irrigation. When he came in for lunch, his face was flushed and his eyes were glassy. Eleanor noticed immediately. She had become an expert at reading his moods, at detecting the signs of incoming storms. "You look unwell," she said carefully, setting down her fork. "I'm fine," he snapped, but his hand trembled as he reached for his glass. Just the damned heat. By dinner, he was worse. His skin had taken on a grey pallor beneath the sunburn, and sweat poured down his face despite the fans. He picked at his food, unable to finish even half of what cook had prepared. "I'm going to bed," he announced abruptly, pushing back from the table. When he stood, he swayed slightly, catching himself on the back of his chair. Eleanor rose to help him, but he waved her off. "I don't need your fussing, woman, it's just exhaustion." She watched him climb the stairs, one heavy step at a time, his hand gripping the banister. Part of her, the part that still remembered being a young bride who had believed in the promises he made, wanted to follow him, to tend to him. But that part was very small now, and growing smaller by the day. Instead, she sat back down and finished her meal in silence. By morning, Thomas couldn't get out of bed. The fever had him in its grip. His body burned hot enough that Eleanor could feel the heat radiating from him when she stood at the bedroom door. His nightshirt was soaked through with sweat, and he thrashed in his sleep, muttering incoherently. Dr. Caldwell arrived by noon, summoned by one of the house servants. He was an old man with kind eyes and steady hands, one of the few people in Charleston County who had shown Eleanor any genuine compassion over the years. He examined Thomas thoroughly while Eleanor waited in the hallway, her hands clasped in front of her. When he emerged, his expression was grave. "It's swamp fever, Mrs. McAllister," he said quietly. "His constitution is strong, but this is serious. He'll need constant care, cool compresses, plenty of fluids, complete rest, no exertion whatsoever for at least 2 months, possibly longer." "Will he recover?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was perfectly neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that made Dr. Caldwell pause. "Most likely, yes, but he'll be weak for some time. The fever damages the body in ways we don't fully understand. He may never regain his full strength." Eleanor nodded slowly, processing this information. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll see that he receives the best care." "Doctor." Caldwell reached out and gently touched her arm. a gesture that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances, but his face held only concern. "Eleanor," he said softly, using her first name for the first time in 20 years. "You look exhausted yourself. Don't forget to care for yourself as well." She smiled at him, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be fine, Doctor. I've had plenty of practice enduring." After he left, Eleanor stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed bedroom door. Behind it, Thomas groaned and called out for water. She could hear his voice, weak and plaintive in a way she had never heard before. For 20 years, she had obeyed that voice, jumped when it commanded, flinched when it rose in anger, silenced herself when it demanded quiet. Now, it was asking for her help. She walked downstairs instead, through the parlor and out onto the front porch. The afternoon sun blazed across the fields where the enslaved workers moved between the rows, their bodies bent under the weight of labor and heat. From here, she could see the overseer, a cruel man named Bennett, who enjoyed his work too much. Walking between them with his whip coiled at his side, Eleanor had never given orders to the overseer before. That was man's work, Thomas's domain. She was simply the lady of the house, responsible for domestic matters and nothing more. She stood there on the porch, her hands resting on the railing, and felt that crack inside her chest widen just a little more. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Eleanor tended to Thomas with the same careful efficiency she brought to all her duties. She cooled his fever, brought him broth when he could keep it down, changed his sweat-soaked sheets. She spoke to him in soft, soothing tones when he was coherent enough to listen. But she also began to move through the house differently. She started asking questions of the household staff, questions about expenses, about supplies, about the running of the estate. Dinah, who had worked in the kitchen for 15 years, looked at her with barely concealed surprise when Eleanor asked to see the account books. "That's usually the master's business, ma'am," Dinah said carefully. "The master is ill," Eleanor replied. "The business doesn't stop because he's in bed." She spent her evenings in Thomas's study, poring over the ledgers by lamplight. What she found appalled her, not because she was shocked by the brutality of slavery, which she had lived alongside for 2 decades, but because she finally understood the full scope of the system she had been complicit in through her silence. Every entry was a person reduced to a number: purchase prices, maintenance costs, expected yields. The human beings who worked this land were listed alongside the livestock and equipment, their value calculated in dollars and cents. She found Ruth's name in a ledger from 7 years ago, purchased at auction in Charleston for $800. "Prime field hand," the notation said. "Good teeth, strong back." Eleanor's hands shook as she closed the book. She thought about the baby in Ruth's cabin, about the child she would never have, about all the ways Thomas had broken her piece by piece while she smiled and said yes and played the perfect wife. The crack in her chest split wider. One evening, 3 weeks into Thomas's illness, Eleanor stood in the doorway of their bedroom watching him sleep. He had lost weight. The fever had burned through him, leaving him gaunt and weak. Without his bluster and his rage, he looked almost ordinary, almost human, but she remembered. She remembered every bruise he'd left on her skin, every time he'd used scripture to justify his cruelty, every moment she'd felt like less than a person in her own home, and she remembered Ruth's baby, sleeping in a basket in a cabin where hope went to die. Thomas stirred, his eyes opening slowly. When he saw her, he tried to smile. "Eleanor," he croaked. "Water." She poured him a glass from the pitcher by the bed and helped him drink. His hand, when it gripped hers, felt fragile, bones wrapped in papery skin. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't know what I'd do without you." Eleanor looked down at him, this man who had owned her for 20 years, who had broken her body trying to force it to produce an heir, who had created a child with a woman who couldn't say no. "You're going to recover," she said softly. "Dr. Caldwell said so." Relief flooded his face. "Good. That's good. The plantation can't run itself. No, Eleanor agreed. It can't. She helped him settle back into the pillows and waited until his breathing deepened into sleep. Then she walked downstairs, through the quiet house, and out onto the front porch. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. In the distance, she could see the faint lights of the slave quarters, could imagine the people there trying to find rest after another day of breaking their bodies for Thomas McAllister's profit. Eleanor stood there for a long time, feeling the night air on her skin, listening to the sounds of cicadas and the distant cry of a night bird. When she finally went back inside, something had shifted in her. Something fundamental. The crack that had been growing in her chest finally split all the way through, and what emerged from the other side wasn't the woman who had existed before. It was something harder, something colder, something that knew exactly what needed to be done. In his bed upstairs, Thomas slept peacefully, unaware that the woman tending to him had stopped being his wife somewhere between the roses and the revelation. She was becoming something else entirely. And when he was strong enough to stand again, he would discover that the world had shifted beneath his feet in ways he could never have imagined. The fever had taken his strength, but Eleanor McAllister had found hers. September brought cooler air to the Lowcountry, though the heat still clung stubbornly to the afternoons. Thomas McAllister had graduated from bed to chair, spending his days in the upstairs sitting room overlooking the front grounds. He was strong enough now to feed himself, to read the newspapers Eleanor brought him, to complain about his weakness. But he was not strong enough to walk more than a few steps without assistance, not strong enough to ride out to the fields, not strong enough to crack the whip that had been an extension of his arm for 30 years, and that changed everything. The morning it began, Eleanor came downstairs wearing one of her simpler dresses, still proper, still neat, but made of sturdier cotton rather than silk. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun rather than the elaborate style she usually wore. When she walked into the dining room, where the senior household staff had gathered for morning assignments, there was something different in the way she carried herself. She stood at the head of the table, Thomas's place, and looked at each of them in turn. Dinah from the kitchen, Samuel, the house steward, Mary, who managed the cleaning, and standing somewhat apart from the others, Bennett, the overseer, his whip coiled at his belt like a sleeping snake. "Mr. McAllister will not be returning to active management of the estate for the foreseeable future," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, clear. "Dr. Caldwell has prescribed at least 2 more months of complete rest, possibly longer. In his absence, I will be overseeing all operations." The room went silent. Bennett's face darkened immediately. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "running a plantation ain't woman's work. There's matters of discipline, I'm aware of what running a plantation entails, Mr. Bennett," Eleanor interrupted. Her eyes locked onto his, and there was something in her gaze that made him falter. "I have lived here for 20 years. I have watched. I have learned. And now I will act." She turned to Samuel. "I need a full accounting of our current stores. Food, supplies, everything. I want it by noon." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, surprise evident in his voice, but he moved immediately to comply. "Dinah, continue with the usual meal preparations, but reduce portions for the main house by 1/3. We'll be economizing." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's gaze returned to Bennett. "You will submit a daily report on field operations. I want to know how many hours are being worked, which fields are being tended, and any disciplinary actions you deem necessary. But those actions must be approved by me first." Bennett's face went from dark to crimson. "Now you wait just a—" "Mr. Bennett," Eleanor's voice could have frozen the Cape Fear River. "You work for this plantation. This plantation belongs to my husband. My husband is incapacitated. That means for the moment you work for me. If you find those terms unacceptable, you are welcome to seek employment elsewhere." The two of them stared at each other across the dining room. Every person in that room understood what was happening. The natural order, the way things had always been, was being turned on its head. A woman was giving orders to a white man. A wife was stepping into her husband's boots. It should have been impossible, but Eleanor stood there unflinching, and Bennett was the one who looked away first. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Good, you're dismissed." As the staff filed out, Eleanor caught Dinah's eye. The older woman paused, something like wonder flickering across her face before she quickly schooled it into neutrality. But Eleanor saw it. More importantly, she understood it. She was not the only person in this house who had been waiting for Thomas McAllister's grip to loosen. That afternoon, Eleanor walked the grounds properly for the first time in her life. Not the decorative gardens or the areas immediately around the big house. She walked the working areas. The barns where tobacco was dried and sorted, the sheds where tools were stored, the smokehouse, the blacksmith's forge, the carpenter's workshop. And finally, she walked to the slave quarters. She had been there only once before, the day she discovered Ruth's baby. The place looked different in full daylight, more real, more brutal. The cabins were worse than she'd imagined, barely more than shacks, their walls thin enough that she could see daylight through the gaps in the boards. There was no furniture to speak of, no comforts of any kind. This was where 53 people lived. This was the foundation upon which Thomas's wealth, her wealth, was built. People stopped working when they saw her approach. They stood in silence, watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but also curiosity, also something that might have been hope, though she suspected they had learned not to indulge that feeling. Eleanor stood in the center of the quarters and looked around at the faces watching her. She saw Ruth standing near one of the cabins, the baby on her hip. The child had grown since she'd seen him last. He was alert now, his grey-blue eyes tracking movement. "I need to speak with everyone," Eleanor said. Her voice carried in the quiet afternoon air. "Please gather around." They came slowly, cautiously, forming a loose circle around her. Men with shoulders bowed by years of labor. Women with hands cracked and bleeding from fieldwork. Children who had never known anything but this life. Eleanor took a breath. What she was about to do could not be undone. She was stepping off a cliff, and there was no climbing back up. "Things are going to change here," she said. "Mr. McAllister is ill and unable to manage the plantation. I am in charge now, and I do not intend to run things the way he did." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor held up a hand. "I cannot free you," she said bluntly, and saw hope die in several faces. "The law does not allow it. Any act of emancipation would have to go through my husband, and he would never consent. But I can change how you are treated while you are here." She turned to face the cabins. "These buildings are unacceptable. We will begin repairs immediately. Proper walls, windows that close, roofs that don't leak. You should not be living in conditions worse than our livestock." More murmuring, louder now. "Working hours will be reduced. No labor before dawn or after dusk. Sundays will be full rest days, not half days. Food rations will be increased to match the physical demands of your work." She paused, letting that sink in. "And there will be no more physical punishment without my explicit approval. Mr. Bennett will be informed that any use of the whip must be justified in writing and submitted to me first." A woman in the back of the crowd made a sound that might have been a sob. An old man closed his eyes, his lips moving in what looked like prayer. Eleanor looked at Ruth, at the baby in her arms. "There will be no more exploitation of the women here. Anyone who comes to me with a complaint of that nature will be heard and believed." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye on her. Finally, an older man stepped forward. She recognized him. Moses, one of the senior field hands, a man Thomas had always called a good worker. His hair was grey, his back bent from decades of labour, but his eyes were sharp. "Why?" he asked simply. It was the question she'd been asking herself for weeks. Why was she doing this? Guilt, revenge, some kind of moral awakening. The truth was messier than any of those things. "Because I'm tired," Eleanor said finally. "I'm tired of pretending that cruelty is natural. Tired of watching suffering and calling it necessity. Tired of being powerless in my own life." She met Moses's gaze steadily. "Because I discovered that my husband had more power over your bodies than I have over my own, and that made me understand that we are not so different, you and I. We are both property in his eyes." Moses studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Time will tell if you mean what you say," he said. "We've heard pretty words before." "Then judge me by my actions," Eleanor replied, "not my words." She walked back to the big house, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. She had crossed a line. She had revealed herself. There was no going back now. That evening, when she brought Thomas his dinner, he was in a foul mood. "Bennett came to see me," he said without preamble. "Said you're making changes. Said you're interfering with the discipline of the workers." Eleanor set the tray across his lap with careful precision. "Bennett is upset because I'm requiring him to justify his actions. I'm sure that's a new experience for him." "Eleanor," Thomas's voice held a warning, "you don't understand how things work. These people need a firm hand. They need to be treated like human beings." Eleanor interrupted. She looked at him steadily. "Which is what I intend to do." Thomas's face flushed with anger, the first real color she'd seen in his cheeks since the fever. "You forget yourself, woman. This is my plantation, my property, your plantation that is failing," Eleanor said calmly. "Your property that is in desperate need of repairs. Your workers who are so exhausted and underfed that productivity has dropped by a third over the past 5 years. I've been reviewing your ledgers." That stopped him short. "You've been—" "What?" "Reading your books. Learning your business." She smoothed her skirt. "Someone had to. You've been too ill to manage things yourself. When you're well enough, we'll discuss it," Eleanor said. "But Dr. Caldwell says that won't be for months. Until then, I suggest you focus on recovering." She left before he could respond, closing the door behind her on his sputtering protests. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what she was doing. Downstairs, she could hear the household staff moving about their evening duties. Through the window, she could see the fields darkening in the twilight, and beyond them, the slave quarters, where 53 people were discovering that hope, no matter how cautious, was starting to bloom again. Eleanor pushed off from the wall and headed to Thomas's study. Her study now, she supposed. There was work to be done, repairs to organize, schedules to rework, a plantation to run in a way that didn't require breaking human beings to make it profitable, and deeper than all of that, a plan forming in her mind, a plan that had started the day she saw Thomas's eyes looking back at her from Ruth's baby. A plan that was about more than just changing working conditions or reducing punishments. This was about something bigger. Something that would shake the very foundations of everything Thomas McAllister had built. But she would be patient. She had learned patience in 20 years of submission. Now she would use it for something else entirely. She sat down at the desk, pulled out a fresh ledger, and began to write. Outside, the sun sank below the horizon, and the Lowcountry darkness settled over the McAllister plantation like a held breath, waiting to see what would come next. October brought the kind of weather that made people forget how brutal Carolina summers could be. The air turned crisp, the humidity finally broke, and the sky blazed that particular shade of blue that only existed in autumn. It was beautiful, deceptive weather. The kind that made you believe things could change. Eleanor was discovering that making things change was considerably harder than wanting them to. The repairs to the slave quarters had begun, but progress was slow. Thomas's financial records revealed that the plantation was in worse condition than she'd realized. Years of extracting maximum profit while minimizing investment had left everything on the edge of collapse. The big house needed repairs too, the equipment was outdated, and the tobacco fields were depleted from years of overcropping without proper rotation. Thomas had been living like a king while his kingdom crumbled around him, but Eleanor was nothing if not determined. She worked from dawn until well past dark, managing accounts, organizing work crews, negotiating with suppliers in Charleston. She wore her simpler dresses now, her hair always in a practical bun, her hands stained with ink from the ledgers. The household staff had adjusted to her management with surprising speed. Samuel, the steward, turned out to be a brilliant organizer when given the authority to make decisions. Dinah ran the kitchen with quiet efficiency and occasionally caught Eleanor's eye with a look of something that might have been solidarity. Bennett, on the other hand, was a constant problem. He followed her new rules only because he had to, but his resentment poisoned everything. He submitted his required reports, but they were vague and unhelpful. When she questioned him about his methods, his answers dripped with barely concealed contempt. And she knew from the whispers of the house staff, from the way the field workers flinched when he passed, that he was finding ways to exert his cruelty outside her oversight. She was in the study one evening, reviewing the week's reports, when she heard raised voices from upstairs, Thomas shouting, then heavy footsteps on the stairs, and Bennett appeared in the doorway of the study, his face triumphant. "The master wants to see you," he said. "Says it's urgent." Eleanor set down her pen carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. That will be all." "Sounds like he's mighty upset about something," Bennett added, not moving. "Might be he's realized things have gone too far while he's been laid up." Eleanor stood, meeting his gaze with ice in her own. "When I require your commentary, Mr. Bennett, I will ask for it. Until then, you're dismissed." She brushed past him and climbed the stairs, her heart pounding, but her face calm. When she entered their bedroom, she found Thomas out of bed for the first time in weeks, standing by the window in his nightshirt. He was leaning heavily on the bedpost, his legs shaking with the effort, but his face was flushed with anger that had nothing to do with fever. "Is it true?" he demanded without preamble. Eleanor closed the door behind her. "Is what true, Thomas? Don't play games with me, woman. Bennett told me everything. The changes you've made. The money you're spending on repairs to the quarters. The new rules about discipline." His voice cracked with rage. "You've turned this place into some kind of a place where human beings are treated with basic dignity?" Eleanor finished. "Yes, I have." "You had no right." Thomas's voice rose to a roar. "This is my plantation, my property, mine." "And you were dying in this bed," Eleanor shot back, her own calm finally cracking. "You were lying here weak as a baby, and someone had to keep things running. That someone was me. I never authorized you never authorized me to do anything, Thomas." The words exploded out of her, carrying 20 years of suppressed rage. "I've lived in this house for 2 decades, and you've never authorized me to have a thought, an opinion, a single moment of agency. You've treated me like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to produce an heir." Thomas's mouth opened and closed. "You forget yourself," he said, but his voice was weaker now. "No." Eleanor took a step toward him. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm remembering myself. The woman I was before you spent 2 decades beating the life out of her. Every time you quoted scripture at me to justify your authority, every time you exercised your rights as a husband regardless of my pain or my illness or my grief, every bruise, every humiliation, every moment you made me feel like I was worth less than the livestock, that was beating the life out of me, Thomas. You just did it slowly enough that no one noticed." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas swayed on his feet, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might collapse. But he caught himself, his jaw working as he struggled to form words. "I am your husband," he finally said. "You owe me obedience. The Bible The Bible also says masters should treat their servants with justice and fairness, Eleanor interrupted. It says the strong should protect the weak. It says that faith without works is dead. You've spent 30 years using scripture to justify your cruelty while ignoring everything it says about mercy and compassion. She moved to the wardrobe and pulled out one of his old work shirts, the rough cotton he'd worn years ago, before wealth had given him the luxury of fine clothes. She threw it on the bed. "You want to know what I've done to your plantation?" she said. "I've started treating the people who work it like they matter. I've begun repairs that should have been done years ago. I've implemented schedules that don't require working people to death. And you know what I've discovered?" Thomas said nothing, just stared at her with something close to shock. "The plantation is actually more productive. When people aren't exhausted and starving and terrified, they work better. When equipment is maintained, it functions better. When buildings don't leak, supplies don't spoil. It's not complicated, Thomas. It's just basic human decency plus common sense." "Bennett says you've gone soft," Thomas muttered. "Says the workers are getting lazy, taking advantage." "Bennett is a sadist who enjoyed hurting people under the guise of discipline," Eleanor said flatly. "Of course he's upset. I've taken away his favorite toy." She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "You're getting stronger every day," she said. "Soon you'll be able to walk again, to ride out to the fields. And when that day comes, you're going to have to decide what kind of man you want to be. The one who rules through fear and violence, or the one who leads through something resembling decency. And if I choose to return things to how they were?" Thomas asked, his voice hard. Eleanor looked back at him over her shoulder. "Then you'll discover that some things, once broken, can never be put back together the same way." She left him standing there and went back downstairs to her study. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit for several minutes before she could pick up her pen again. But she had said it. Finally, after 20 years, she had said all the things that had been eating her alive from the inside. And the world hadn't ended. The next morning, Eleanor woke early and dressed with particular care. Not in her work clothes, but in one of her better day dresses. She did her hair properly, pinned up and neat. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. There was something harder in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there 6 months ago. She had a plan for today, a plan that had been forming since the moment she discovered Ruth's baby, crystallizing through weeks of managing the plantation, solidifying last night when she'd finally spoken her truth to Thomas, a plan that would horrify anyone who knew about it. A plan that felt more right than anything she'd ever done. She went to Thomas's room and found him still in bed, exhausted from yesterday's exertion. Without a word, she helped him sit up and brought him breakfast. She was gentle, efficient, the model of wifely care. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Thomas said carefully, "about the plantation being more productive." "Yes?" Eleanor's voice was neutral. Perhaps some of your changes have merit. The repairs, at least, the equipment maintenance." He was choosing his words carefully, she noticed, trying to regain some control while conceding ground. "But the discipline issue, that needs to be handled properly." "I agree," Eleanor said. "Discipline is important." Thomas looked relieved. "Then when I'm stronger, we can discuss returning things to—" "What I mean," Eleanor interrupted gently, "is that you need discipline, Thomas." He stared at her. "What?" "Dr. Caldwell was very clear. You're not to exert yourself. You're to rest, to rebuild your strength gradually. But I know you. The moment you feel even slightly better, you'll try to do too much. You'll ride out to the fields, work yourself into exhaustion and relapse." She smoothed the blanket across his lap. "So I'm going to help you learn discipline, self-control, the ability to do hard work without complaint. Eleanor, what are you— You're always saying that hard work builds character," she continued, her voice still gentle, but her eyes cold. "That physical labor is good for the soul, that people need to understand the value of a hard day's work." Understanding was beginning to dawn in Thomas's eyes, along with something that might have been fear. "Well, you're going to get the chance to prove it," Eleanor said. "As soon as you're strong enough to stand without assistance, you're going to work. Not managing from horseback, but real work, in the fields, alongside the men you've spent 30 years driving like animals." "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." Eleanor stood. "You've been preaching the virtue of labor your entire adult life. Now you're going to practice what you preach." "I'll divorce you," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I'll have you declared insane. You'll do nothing," Eleanor said calmly. "Because if you try, I'll make sure everyone in Charleston County knows about Ruth's baby, about the child you fathered while I was losing mine, about how the great Thomas McAllister, who preaches biblical morality from his front porch, forced himself on a woman he owned." Thomas's face went white. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would. Gladly." Eleanor smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Your reputation, your standing in society, your membership in the church, all of it would be destroyed. You'd be ruined, and so would I, probably, but I find I don't care anymore." She walked to the door. "Start building your strength, Thomas," she said. "You're going to need it." She spent the rest of that day making arrangements. She had the blacksmith fashion a set of work tools, a hoe, a shovel, all the implements a field hand would need. She had Dinah prepare a different kind of meal, the simple corn mash and salt pork that was standard fare for the workers, not the elaborate dishes served in the big house. And she had Samuel bring up a set of rough work clothes from storage. When the household staff realized what she was planning, the looks they gave her ranged from horror to barely concealed satisfaction. Only Moses, when she went to the quarters to inform him of what was coming, showed something close to concern. "This is a dangerous path, Mom," he said quietly. "What happens when he's strong again, when he can fight back?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Then we'll find out if I'm as brave as I think I am. And if you're not, then at least I'll know I tried." 2 weeks later, Thomas was strong enough to walk without assistance. His legs were still shaky. His stamina was poor, but Dr. Caldwell pronounced him well enough for light activity. Eleanor took that as her signal. She woke Thomas before dawn, as the first grey light was touching the horizon. She handed him the rough work clothes and a pair of worn boots. "Get dressed," she said. "Eleanor, get dressed, or I ride to Charleston today and tell everyone about your bastard child." The threat hung in the air between them. Thomas's face cycled through rage, denial, and finally resignation. With shaking hands, he pulled on the coarse clothes. They walked out to the fields as the sun was rising, Eleanor in her usual dress and Thomas in his worker's clothes. The enslaved people gathering for the day's labor stopped and stared. Whispers ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Eleanor stood on a small rise overlooking the tobacco field and raised her voice to carry. "Mr. McAllister has decided that he wants to better understand the work that sustains this plantation," she announced. "He will be laboring alongside you for the foreseeable future. Bennett, assign him a row." Bennett looked like he might refuse, but one glance at Eleanor's face convinced him otherwise. With obvious reluctance, he handed Thomas a hoe and pointed to a section of field that needed weeding. Thomas stood there, the hoe heavy in his hands, staring at the rows of tobacco stretching out before him. The sun was climbing higher now, and already the day was warming. Around him, the field workers had returned to their tasks, but Eleanor could see them watching from the corners of their eyes. "Well," Eleanor said quietly, "you've given this order 1,000 times. Now follow it yourself." Thomas looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might throw down the hoe and storm back to the house, consequences be damned. But something in her face, perhaps the absolute certainty that she would make good on her threat, kept him rooted in place. He bent to the work. The first hour was almost amusing, in a dark way. Thomas attacked the weeds with furious energy, as if he could somehow prove his strength through sheer aggression. But he had no technique, no rhythm. He exhausted himself quickly, his breathing becoming labored, his movements growing clumsy. By the second hour, he was drenched in sweat. By the third, his hands were blistering. Eleanor stood in the shade of a live oak at the edge of the field, a parasol in one hand, watching. She didn't move to help him, didn't call for a break. She simply watched as her husband, the man who had spent 3 decades proclaiming the virtue of hard labor, discovered what that labor actually felt like. Moses worked in the row next to Thomas, his movements efficient and practiced. At one point, when Thomas stumbled and nearly fell, Moses caught his arm and steadied him. "Small movements," Moses said quietly. "Don't try to do too much at once. The day is long. You got to pace yourself." Thomas jerked his arm away, pride overriding pragmatism. But Eleanor saw him slow down afterward, saw him trying to mimic the economical movements of the workers around him. When the sun reached its zenith and the overseer called for the midday break, Thomas collapsed in the shade. His face was bright red, his hands were bleeding, and he was shaking with exhaustion. Eleanor approached with a ladle of water and a bowl of corn mash. "This is insane," Thomas gasped. I'm not strong enough yet." "Then you should have thought about that before you drove sick men into the fields," Eleanor said, "before you worked people through fever and injury because the crop couldn't wait." She held out the bowl. "Eat. You have 4 more hours before sundown." "Eleanor, please." "Did they get mercy when they begged?" Her voice was ice. "Did I get mercy when I begged you to wait, to be gentle, to give me time to heal?" Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond anger in his eyes. She saw the beginning of understanding, of recognition. "This is what you wanted to teach them," Eleanor said softly. "Humility through suffering, character through hardship. Well, now you get to learn those lessons yourself." The afternoon was worse than the morning. Thomas's initial surge of angry energy was gone, replaced by simple exhaustion. His movements became mechanical, mindless. He fell behind the other workers, his row perpetually unfinished, while theirs advanced steadily. Bennett circled like a vulture, his face twisted with barely suppressed glee. "Move faster, field hand," he shouted at one point. "You're slowing down the whole crew." Thomas straightened, rage flashing across his face. "How dare you?" But Eleanor was there before he could finish. "Mr. Bennett," she said coldly, "that will be all. Return to your other duties." Bennett slunk away, disappointed. Thomas stared at her. "You're enjoying this?" he said. "No," Eleanor replied honestly. "I'm not enjoying it, but I'm not stopping it either." When the sun finally sank below the tree line and the workday ended, Thomas could barely walk. Eleanor had Samuel help him back to the house, not to his bedroom, but to a small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage. "This is where you'll sleep now," she said. "Field hands rise at dawn, so will you. The bedroom is mine. You gave up the right to share it when you created a child with Ruth." She had his dinner brought to him, the same simple fare the workers ate. Thomas stared at the bowl of mush and salt pork as if he'd never seen food before. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long are you going to do this?" Eleanor considered the question. "Until you understand, really understand what you've been doing to people for 30 years. Until you can look Ruth in the eye and see a human being instead of property. Until you remember that I'm a person too, not just a vessel for your heir." "I could overpower you," Thomas said. "I'm still stronger." "Are you?" Eleanor asked. "Because you didn't look very strong today, and tomorrow you'll be even weaker, and the day after that weaker still. That's what this kind of work does, Thomas. It breaks you down day after day until there's nothing left but the will to survive." She moved to the door. "And if you do try to overpower me, if you raise your hand to me ever again, I will make sure Ruth's child is front and center at the next church social." I wonder how the congregation would react to those grey-blue eyes. That night, Eleanor lay alone in the bedroom she had shared with Thomas for 20 years and stared at the ceiling. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was racing. What she was doing was monstrous by any conventional measure. She was torturing her husband, humiliating him, breaking him down physically and mentally. She was doing to him exactly what he had done to her, and she felt no guilt, none at all. That realization should have frightened her. She had been raised to be gentle, compassionate, forgiving. Good Christian women didn't harbor vengeance in their hearts. They turned the other cheek. They submitted to their husbands in all things. But Eleanor had turned the other cheek for 20 years, and all it had earned her was bruises on both sides. The next morning, she woke Thomas before dawn and sent him back to the fields, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. November arrived with unexpected cold. Frost touched the fields in the mornings, and the workers' breath misted in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas had been working in the fields for 6 weeks now, and the change in him was profound. He had lost weight. His hands, once soft despite his riding and hunting, were now calloused and scarred. His face had darkened from the sun, and there was a hollow look in his eyes that Eleanor recognized from the faces of long-term field workers. The look of someone whose spirit was being slowly ground down by relentless physical labor. Part of her felt satisfaction at this transformation, but a growing part of her was beginning to feel something else. Not quite guilt. She couldn't bring herself to feel guilty for making Thomas experience even a fraction of what he'd inflicted on others. But something adjacent to it, a recognition that revenge, no matter how justified, had a cost. She sat in the study one evening reviewing the plantation accounts when Dinah appeared in the doorway. "Mom, there's something you should know." Eleanor set down her pen. "What is it?" "It's about the master, the workers. They've been talking." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What kind of talking?" "Not what you might think," Dinah said carefully. Some of them are worried about him. Moses especially. He says the master's losing too much weight too fast, says he's pushing himself too hard, not eating enough." Eleanor frowned. "I've made sure he gets the same rations as everyone else." "That's just it, ma'am. He's not used to that kind of work on those rations. His body's eating itself." Dinah hesitated. "Moses asked me to tell you. He says he don't want the master's death on his conscience." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Death. She hadn't been thinking in those terms. She'd been so focused on teaching Thomas a lesson, on making him understand, that she hadn't considered she might actually be killing him. "Thank you, Dinah," she said quietly. I'll think about what you've said." After Dinah left, Eleanor sat in the darkening study for a long time. Through the window, she could see the last light fading from the sky. Somewhere in the small room off the kitchen, Thomas was probably already asleep, his body too exhausted to do anything else. What was she doing? What had she become? She had set out to teach Thomas empathy, to make him understand the suffering he'd caused. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped being about education and started being about punishment, about making him hurt the way she had hurt. And the terrible truth was that it still wasn't enough. 20 years of pain couldn't be balanced by 6 weeks of hard labor. Ruth's stolen agency couldn't be restored by humiliating Thomas. The 53 people still enslaved on this plantation weren't any freer because their master now understood what fieldwork felt like. All she had really accomplished was adding more suffering to a world already drowning in it. Eleanor stood and walked through the quiet house to the small room where Thomas slept. She opened the door carefully, letting the lamplight from the hallway spill across his sleeping form. He looked like a different person. The proud, powerful man who had once filled every room with his presence had been whittled down to something much smaller. His face, even in sleep, was drawn with exhaustion. His hands, resting on the thin blanket, were a mass of healing blisters and fresh calluses. She thought about waking him, about telling him it was over, that he could return to the bedroom, that she'd made her point. But then she remembered. She remembered the sound of his belt coming off before he used it on her. She remembered lying in bed after another miscarriage, her body broken and bleeding, while he complained about his dinner being cold. She remembered the cold calculation in his eyes when he spoke about the property he owned, human beings reduced to livestock in his ledgers. She remembered Ruth's baby, those grey-blue eyes staring up at her from a basket in a cabin that should never have existed. No, she wasn't done yet, but she needed to change her approach. Because Dinah was right. If she kept pushing him like this, Thomas might actually die. And despite everything, she didn't want that. She wanted him to live with what he'd learned. She wanted him to be better. Or maybe, a dark voice whispered in her mind, she just wasn't ready to be a murderer. The next morning, Eleanor made a change. She still sent Thomas to the fields, but she shortened his hours. She increased his food rations. She made sure Dr. Caldwell came by weekly to check on his health. And she started going out to the fields herself. Not to supervise. Samuel and the other overseers could handle that. She went to work. The first time she picked up a hoe and took her place in a row, the entire field went silent. Thomas, 2 rows over, stared at her in shock. The enslaved workers looked at her with expressions ranging from confusion to something that might have been respect. "Well," Eleanor said, meeting Moses's eyes. "Are we working or not?" Moses smiled. Just a small quirk of his lips, but it was genuine. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose we are." Eleanor had never done physical labor in her life beyond tending her roses. Within an hour, her back was screaming. Within 2 hours, her hands were blistering. By the end of the day, she could barely walk. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. She couldn't explain even to herself why she was doing this. Maybe it was some kind of penance. Maybe it was solidarity with the people whose labor she'd benefited from for 20 years without really seeing them. Maybe it was just the natural next step in her complete breakdown of everything she'd once been. Whatever the reason, she kept coming back. Thomas, working in the row next to hers one afternoon, finally broke his weeks of sullen silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Eleanor paused in her work, straightening slowly. Her back cracked audibly. "I could ask you the same question. Why did you do any of this? Why build your wealth on breaking people? Why treat human beings like animals?" "I was raised to it," Thomas said. "My father did it, his father before him. It's how things are. That's not a reason, that's an excuse." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hoe moving mechanically through the soil. "You asked me once why I was cruel to you," he said finally. "Why I hurt you when you were already suffering." Eleanor waited, barely breathing. "The truth is I don't know," Thomas continued. "I tell myself it was my right, that the Bible gave me authority over you. But the real truth is that hurting you made me feel powerful. Made me feel like I had control over something, in a world that felt like it was always on the edge of spinning apart." He looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. "I was a coward, Eleanor. I took my fear and my rage and my own sense of powerlessness, and I fed it to you piece by piece until there was nothing left of the woman I married." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of her rage. "And now?" she asked. "Now that you know what it feels like to be powerless, to have someone else control every aspect of your existence." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Now I understand why Moses looks at me the way he does. Why they all do. I'm not a man to them. I'm a monster. And the worst part is, they're right." They worked in silence for a while after that, the only sounds the scrape of hoes in soil and the distant calls of birds. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, and the overseer called the end of the work-day, Eleanor found herself walking back to the house alongside Thomas, instead of ahead of him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "For Ruth, for the baby, for 20 years of making me feel like I was worthless." "I don't deserve forgiveness," Thomas replied. "I know that. But maybe—" Eleanor paused, searching for the right words. Maybe we can figure out how to be different people than we were, both of us. That night, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't free the enslaved people on the plantation. The law wouldn't allow it, and even if it did, where would they go? Freed black people in South Carolina faced constant danger, constant restrictions. Freedom without resources or protection was often just a different kind of death sentence. But she could do something. She spent the next 2 weeks in Charleston, meeting with lawyers and bank officials. She set up trusts, signed documents, made arrangements that would have been scandalous if anyone understood what they meant. When she returned to the plantation, she called a meeting of all the workers in the main yard. Thomas stood beside her. She'd asked him to be there, and after a moment's hesitation, he'd agreed. "I can't give you freedom," Eleanor said, her voice carrying in the cool evening air. "The law won't allow it, and even if it did, the world out there is not safe for free black people in South Carolina. But I can give you something else." She held up a stack of papers. "These are individual trust accounts set up in Charleston for each person on this plantation. Every month, a portion of the plantation's profits will be divided among these accounts. It's not wages. Legally, I can't pay you wages. But it's money that belongs to you, held in trust until the day you are free." A murmur ran through the crowd. Moses stepped forward. "And if that day never comes, then the money passes to your children," Eleanor said, "and to their children, however long it takes." Ruth spoke up from the back of the crowd, the baby on her hip. "Why would you do this?" Eleanor looked at her, at the child with Thomas's eyes, and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on her shoulders. "Because I can't undo the past," she said. "I can't give back the years that were stolen from you. I can't erase the suffering. But I can try to build a different future for all of us." She glanced at Thomas, who was staring at the ground, his jaw working. "It's not enough," Eleanor continued. "It will never be enough, but it's what I can do, what we can do." Thomas looked up at that, meeting her eyes. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "What my wife said," Thomas said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, I spent 30 years believing I was righteous, that my power over you was ordained by God, that breaking you down was somehow building myself up." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong about all of it, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed was profound. An apology couldn't heal decades of trauma. Words couldn't undo the systematic destruction of human dignity that slavery represented. But sometimes words were where healing had to start. Moses stepped forward again. "We'll see if your actions match your words," he said. "Both of you. Time will tell." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "It will." That night, Eleanor and Thomas sat together in the study for the first time since his illness. They didn't sit close. Thomas took the chair by the window while Eleanor remained at the desk. But they were in the same room, and that was something. "I'm going to keep working in the fields," Thomas said, "not as punishment, but because I need to remember. Every day, I need to remember what I did." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And I'm going to keep managing the plantation. Not because you're incapable, but because I'm good at it." "You are," Thomas admitted. "Better than I was, probably. Definitely better than you were," Eleanor corrected, and there might have been the ghost of a smile on her lips. They sat in silence for a while, watching the lamplight flicker on the walls. "Can we ever come back from this?" Thomas asked finally. "From everything that's happened?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I don't know if we can come back," she said. "But maybe we can go forward as different people, people who know what it means to be broken and are trying to figure out how to be whole." "I don't know how to do that," Thomas said. "Neither do I," Eleanor replied, "but we can learn." Outside, the November wind rustled through the live oaks, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from the quarters. Somewhere in those cabins, 53 people were settling in for the night, perhaps for the first time daring to hope that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. Perhaps for the first time believing that change was possible. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even close to justice, but it was a start. Spring came to the Lowcountry in 1852 with an explosion of color that felt almost obscene. Azaleas bloomed in riots of pink and purple. Wisteria draped itself over every available surface, perfuming the air with sweetness. The fields, properly rotated and managed for the first time in decades, produced crops that exceeded even Eleanor's careful projections. The McAllister plantation, by all external measures, was thriving. But success, Eleanor had learned, was more complicated than profit margins. Thomas continued to work in the fields, though his role had evolved. He was no longer simply laboring as punishment. He had become something like a crew leader, someone who understood the work from the inside and could make practical decisions about pacing and methodology. The enslaved workers still didn't trust him entirely. That kind of trust couldn't be rebuilt in months, maybe not even in years, but the naked fear had faded from their eyes when he approached. Eleanor had kept her promise about the trust accounts. Every month she made the journey to Charleston to deposit funds. The amounts weren't large. The plantation's finances were still recovering from years of mismanagement, but they were consistent. A small accounting of dignity in a system built on denying it. She had also kept her promise to herself. She continued to work in the fields several days a week, though she'd learned to pace herself better. Her hands were permanently calloused now, her skin several shades darker from the sun. The society ladies in Charleston barely recognized her on her monthly trips to the bank. Not that they would have acknowledged her anyway. Word had spread about the changes at the McAllister plantation. The whispers started in church parlors and spread through dinner parties. Eleanor McAllister had lost her mind, they said. She was working like a field hand. She was giving money to slaves. She had somehow broken her husband's spirit and turned their plantation into some kind of bizarre social experiment. The McAllister name, once respected throughout the Lowcountry, had become something else. A curiosity, a scandal, a curse. Eleanor found she didn't care. She was sitting on the front porch one humid May afternoon, reviewing supply orders, when a carriage came up the drive. Eleanor didn't recognize it. It was too fine for any of their usual suppliers, too formal for a social call. She set down her papers and stood, shading her eyes against the sun. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the carriage, his face grave. "Doctor," Eleanor said, concern flooding through her. "Is something wrong? Is it Thomas?" No, Caldwell said quickly. "Thomas is fine as far as I know. I'm here about something else. May I come in?" They settled in the parlor, and Eleanor poured them both tea from the pot that was kept perpetually warm. Caldwell took his cup, but didn't drink, just stared into it, as if searching for the right words. "Eleanor," he finally said, "I've been your physician for 20 years. I've seen you through illness, through difficult times. I've always tried to look after your well-being." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "You've been kind to me when others weren't. Then please understand that what I'm about to tell you comes from a place of genuine concern." He set down his cup. "There are people in Charleston, influential people, who are talking about having you declared mentally incompetent." Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly. "What?" "Your behavior over the past months has been unconventional. Working in the fields, the financial arrangements you've made, the way you've—" he gestured helplessly, "the way you've restructured everything. There are those who believe you've had some kind of breakdown, that you're not in your right mind." "And you?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp. "Do you believe that?" Caldwell met her eyes steadily. "No, I think you're the sanest person I know. I think you woke up from a 20-year nightmare and decided to do something about it. But Eleanor, my opinion doesn't matter if enough powerful men decide you're unstable." "Or they want to take the plantation away from me," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "They want to put it back under proper male control. Thomas would be declared recovered, but influenced by his mentally unfit wife. They'd likely appoint a conservator to manage the estate until Thomas can resume his natural authority. Caldwell's voice dripped with disgust at the words, which is a polite way of saying they'd strip you of all power and return things to how they were. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields where Thomas and the workers were bringing in the early tobacco. She could see him out there, his shirt dark with sweat, working alongside Moses and the others. He looked healthy now, thin but strong, purposeful in a way he'd never been when he was cracking the whip from horseback. "What would you advise?" she asked. "Honestly, I'd advise you to be more conventional. To step back from the field work, to let Thomas resume his role as master, to stop doing things that make powerful people uncomfortable." He paused. "But I don't think you're going to do that." "No," Eleanor agreed, "I'm not." "Then I'd advise you to be very, very careful. Document everything. Keep impeccable records of the plantation's improved profitability. Make sure Thomas is seen as a willing participant in these changes, not a victim of your influence." Caldwell stood and moved to stand beside her at the window. "And prepare yourself for the possibility that they might succeed anyway. Power doesn't like to be challenged, especially not by women." After Caldwell left, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor for a long time. She had known on some level that there would be consequences to what she was doing. But she had been so focused on the immediate changes, on teaching Thomas empathy, on improving conditions for the workers, on finding some way to live with her own complicity in the system, that she hadn't fully considered the larger forces arrayed against her. She was one woman, trying to introduce a tiny sliver of humanity into a system built on denying it. Of course, the system would fight back. That evening she told Thomas what Caldwell had said. They were in the study together, going over the day's work. Thomas had moved back into the main house, though he still slept in a separate bedroom. They existed in a strange limbo between married couple and business partners, trying to figure out what they were to each other now. Thomas's face darkened as she spoke. "They want to declare you incompetent for making the plantation more profitable, for challenging the natural order," Eleanor corrected. "For being a woman who refuses to stay in her assigned place." "I won't let them do it," Thomas said. "I'll testify on your behalf. I'll tell them that every change was made with my full support and knowledge." "Will they believe you? Or will they just decide that I've somehow manipulated you?" Eleanor shook her head. "This isn't a battle we can win with testimony, Thomas. The men who want to remove me from power don't care about facts. They care about maintaining control. Then what do we do?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, an idea forming in her mind. It was risky, maybe insane, but then again, people already thought she was insane. "We disappear," she said. Thomas stared at her. "What?" "Not literally, but we withdraw. Stop going to Charleston except when absolutely necessary. Stop participating in society. Let the plantation speak for itself. It's profitable, it's well run, and everyone here is healthy." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Let them talk. Let them whisper about the crazy McAllisters. As long as we're not causing problems or scandals, as long as the plantation is successful, they'll eventually lose interest. You want to become hermits? I want to build something here that's more important than dinner parties and church socials," Eleanor said. "And I can't do that while constantly trying to justify myself to people who will never understand." Thomas considered this, his fingers drumming on the desk. "What about the workers? What about the trust accounts? If they declare you incompetent, all of that goes away. Then we need to make sure the trust accounts are bulletproof. Multiple lawyers, documentation that shows they were your idea as much as mine. We make it so complicated to unravel that it's easier to just leave it alone." "This is going to cost us socially," Thomas said. "We'll be outcasts." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Thomas, we're already outcasts. We're just making it official. Over the next months, they implemented Eleanor's plan. They stopped accepting social invitations. They stopped attending church services where they had to endure whispered comments and pointed stares. They focused entirely on the plantation, on the work, on building something that might, just might, be better than what they'd inherited. The whispers in Charleston grew louder. The McAllisters had completely lost their minds. They were living like field hands. Thomas had been emasculated by his domineering wife. Eleanor had corrupted him with her radical ideas. Let them talk, Eleanor thought. Words couldn't hurt her anymore. She'd survived 20 years of much worse. What none of the gossips in Charleston realized was that the McAllister plantation was becoming something unique. It wasn't freedom. Eleanor had no illusions about that. The people working the fields were still enslaved, still bound by laws that defined them as property. But within those constraints, she and Thomas were trying to create something different. Cabins with real roofs and doors that locked from the inside. Food rations that reflected actual caloric needs. Medical care provided by Dr. Caldwell on a regular schedule. Work hours that allowed for rest. The trust accounts that slowly accumulated penny by penny. And perhaps most importantly, something subtler, a shift in how people related to each other. Thomas no longer gave orders from on high. He asked questions, listened to suggestions from people who had been working the land longer than he'd been alive. Eleanor ate her midday meal with the workers sometimes, sitting in the shade and talking about crops, weather, families. It wasn't equality. It couldn't be, not within the structure of slavery, but it was something less brutal than what had existed before. One evening in late summer, Eleanor was tending her roses when Ruth approached her. The baby, over a year old now starting to walk, was balanced on Ruth's hip. "Mom," Ruth said tentatively, "can I speak with you?" "Of course," Eleanor said, setting down her shears. Ruth shifted the baby to her other hip, nervous. I needed to say something about the changes, about everything." Eleanor waited, giving her time. "When you first found out about," Ruth glanced down at the child. "About him, I thought you'd kill me, or sell me away. That's what usually happens when the mistress finds out about the masters, about children like this." "I know," Eleanor said softly, "but you didn't. You changed things instead." Ruth's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I still wake up every morning expecting it all to go back to how it was, expecting the whip and the hunger and the fear, but it's been months, and it hasn't happened yet." "It's not going to happen," Eleanor said. "Not while I have anything to say about it." But that's just it, Mom. You might not always have a say. We all know what they're saying in Charleston, what they want to do." Ruth took a shaky breath. "If they take you away, if they put someone else in charge, all of this goes away. We go back to being nothing." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I'm doing everything I can to prevent that. I know you are." Ruth reached out and, very carefully, touched Eleanor's hand. It was a gesture that could have gotten her whipped in the old days. "I just wanted you to know that even if they do take it all away, even if everything goes back to how it was, we'll remember. We'll remember that for a little while there was something different, something better, and we'll tell our children about it, and they'll tell theirs." The tears Eleanor had been holding back spilled over. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I can't do more. I'm sorry I can't actually free you." "You freed something in us," Ruth said. "Maybe not our bodies, but something. That matters too." After Ruth left, Eleanor stood alone in her rose garden as darkness fell around her. The roses her mother had planted so many years ago had thrived under her care, blooming more beautifully than ever. But roses had thorns, and beauty always came with the potential for pain. She heard footsteps and turned to find Thomas standing at the edge of the garden, his work clothes dusty from the fields. "I was looking for you," he said. "I'm here." He moved closer, and in the twilight Eleanor could see how much he'd changed. Not just physically, though the soft southern gentleman was gone, replaced by someone harder and leaner, but in his eyes. There was a clarity there that hadn't existed before, an understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that constantly tried to reduce people to categories and commodities. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what happens if they succeed, if they declare you incompetent and take control of the plantation. And I realize something. They can take away your legal authority, but they can't take away what you've built here, what we've built. The workers know things can be different now. I know it. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because some lawyers in Charleston decide you're unfit to manage property." He reached out and took her hand, carefully asking permission with his eyes first. "If they come for you, I'll fight them. Not because I think I can win, but because it's the right thing to do. And if they win anyway, I'll keep doing what we've been doing. I'll honor the trust accounts. I'll maintain the conditions we've established. I'll remember." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, both calloused now, both marked by labor. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that?" "Because you taught me to be human again," Thomas said simply. "You broke me down and rebuilt me, and I'm not going back to being the monster I was, even if it costs me everything." They stood together in the garden as the last light faded from the sky. They weren't the people they'd been a year ago. Eleanor wasn't the silent, obedient wife. Thomas wasn't the cruel master. They were something new, something that didn't quite fit into the rigid categories their world demanded. And maybe that was the point. The next morning, Eleanor received a letter from Charleston. The seal was official. Legal proceedings were being initiated to examine her mental competency. There would be a hearing in 3 weeks. She would need to appear before a judge and a panel of doctors to determine whether she was fit to manage her own affairs. Eleanor read the letter twice, then set it aside and went about her day. She worked in the fields, reviewed the accounts, had dinner with Thomas while they discussed crop rotation strategies. She went to bed that night not knowing what the future held, but certain that she had done the right thing. 3 weeks later, she dressed in her finest remaining dress, not the elaborate silk she used to wear, but a simple, elegant gown that spoke of dignity rather than ostentation. Thomas wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable in proper clothing after months in work clothes. They rode to Charleston together, the carriage wheels crunching on the oyster shell roads. The hearing was held in a judge's chambers, not a public courtroom. The judge was a man Eleanor vaguely knew from church, stern-faced and proper. The panel of doctors included Dr. Caldwell and 2 others she didn't recognize. The lawyers for the petitioners, wealthy landowners who wanted to see the McAllister plantation returned to proper management, sat in their expensive suits and looked at Eleanor like she was something distasteful they'd found on their shoes. The lead petitioner's lawyer stood first. He was a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache and the kind of voice that was accustomed to being obeyed. "Your Honor, we are here today because of grave concerns about Mrs. Eleanor McAllister's mental fitness. Over the past year, she has engaged in a series of increasingly erratic behaviors that suggest a severe deterioration of her rational faculties." He began listing her supposed transgressions like items on a ledger. Working alongside enslaved laborers in the fields, implementing radical changes to plantation management without proper male oversight, establishing financial arrangements that defied conventional wisdom, withdrawing from society, allowing her husband to be reduced to manual labor. Eleanor sat still and silent through all of it, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. She had learned long ago how to make herself invisible when powerful men were speaking. But she wasn't invisible anymore, not really. When the lawyer finally finished, the judge turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. McAllister, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Eleanor stood slowly. She could feel every eye in the room on her, could sense the expectation that she would break down, would prove their point by becoming emotional or incoherent. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a leather portfolio. "Your Honor, if I may present evidence." The judge looked surprised, but nodded. "Proceed." Eleanor opened the portfolio and began laying documents on the table. These are the financial records for the McAllister plantation for the past 5 years. As you can see, the years before my husband's illness showed declining profits, mounting debts, and significant depreciation of assets. She laid out another set of papers. These are the records for the past year, during which I have managed the estate. Profits are up 30%, debts have been reduced by half, equipment has been properly maintained for the first time in years. We've had 0 crop failures due to poor planning or exhausted soil. The judge leaned forward, studying the numbers. Eleanor continued, "These gentlemen say I've been erratic. I would argue that I've been practical. Working in the fields myself has given me first-hand knowledge of the labor required, which has allowed me to implement more efficient schedules. The improvements to worker housing have reduced illness, which means less lost productivity. The trust accounts they find so troubling, they're an investment in long-term stability. Satisfied workers are productive workers." She met the judge's eyes directly. "I have not abandoned feminine propriety because I've lost my mind, Your Honor. I've abandoned it because it was interfering with my ability to run a successful business." One of the unfamiliar doctors spoke up. "Mrs. McAllister, what about the concerns regarding your husband? It's been reported that you forced him to work in degrading conditions." Thomas stood before Eleanor could respond. "If I may, Your Honor," the judge nodded, curiosity evident on his face. "My wife did not force me to do anything," Thomas said clearly. "I was recovering from swamp fever that nearly killed me. The doctors recommended light exercise as part of my convalescence. Working in the fields provided that exercise, while also giving me valuable insight into the operations of my own plantation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I had been managing this estate for 30 years, based on assumptions and traditions passed down from my father. My wife's unconventional approach made me question those assumptions, and the results speak for themselves." Thomas pulled out another document. "This is a letter from the Charleston Agricultural Society, congratulating us on our tobacco yield this year. This is a note from the bank, praising our debt reduction and offering to extend additional credit if needed. These are not the marks of a poorly managed estate." The petitioner's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is all beside the point. A woman working in the fields like a common laborer is evidence of unsound mind, regardless of financial outcomes. It defies all natural law, all proper order." "All proper order," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife, "says that women should be silent and obedient, that we should accept whatever authority men choose to exercise over us without question, that our role is to be decorative and reproductive, nothing more." She turned to face the lawyer directly. "I followed that proper order for 20 years. I was the perfect wife, silent, obedient, asking for nothing, and it nearly destroyed me." The room had gone completely silent. Eleanor could feel Dr. Caldwell's eyes on her, willing her to be careful. But she was done being careful. "You want to declare me insane because I stopped accepting abuse as my natural condition, because I looked at a system that was bleeding my husband's estate dry and decided to fix it, because I dared to step outside the narrow box you've built for women and discovered that I was capable of more than bearing children and pouring tea." She looked at each man in the room in turn. "If competence, intelligence, and the ability to run a profitable business are signs of insanity in a woman, then yes, I am quite mad. But I would suggest that says more about your definition of sanity than it does about my mental state." The judge sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. McAllister, you make a compelling case. However, the concerns raised by the petitioners are not entirely without merit. Your behavior has been highly unusual." "Unusual is not the same as incompetent," Eleanor said. "And incompetence is the legal standard for what you're being asked to declare, is it not?" One of the doctors spoke up, not Caldwell, but one of the others. "Your Honor, if I may, I've reviewed the medical records provided by Dr. Caldwell, and I've observed Mrs. McAllister's demeanor here today. I see no evidence of mental illness. Unconventional behavior, yes, but unconventional is not synonymous with incompetent or insane. I concur, Caldwell added quickly. Mrs. McAllister is in full possession of her faculties. She has simply chosen to exercise those faculties in ways that challenge social conventions. The third doctor nodded reluctantly. I must agree with my colleagues. Unusual life choices are not grounds for a finding of incompetence. The petitioner's lawyer looked furious. Your Honor, surely you cannot— What I can do, the judge interrupted, is make a ruling based on the evidence presented to me. And that evidence shows a woman who has successfully managed a complex agricultural business, improved its profitability, and maintained detailed records of her decisions and their outcomes. He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been respect. Mrs. McAllister, I find no legal grounds to declare you mentally incompetent. This petition is denied. The gavel came down, and Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. Thomas was beside her immediately, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. The petitioner's lawyer gathered his papers with barely controlled rage. This is an outrage, he muttered. A woman has no business. A woman has whatever business she proves herself capable of handling, the judge said sharply, as Mrs. McAllister has clearly done. Good day, gentlemen. As they left the chambers, Eleanor could hear the whispers starting immediately. The scandal would only grow now. The crazy McAllister woman had won. She'd defied the natural order and gotten away with it. Let them whisper, Eleanor thought. Let them talk. She had won something far more important than social approval. She had won the right to define herself. The carriage ride back to the plantation was quiet. Eleanor and Thomas sat side by side, processing what had happened. The danger wasn't entirely past. There would be other challenges, other attempts to undermine what they'd built. But for now, they had breathing room. That was terrifying, Thomas said finally. Yes, Eleanor agreed. You were magnificent. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised. I was angry. You were honest, Thomas corrected. You told the truth in a room full of men who have spent their entire lives avoiding it. That took courage. They fell silent again, watching the landscape roll past. The Lowcountry was beautiful in autumn, the marsh grasses turning gold, the sky that particular shade of blue that seemed to exist nowhere else on earth. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now? Eleanor considered the question. Now we keep doing what we've been doing. We run the plantation. We honor our commitments. We try to be better than we were, and when they come after us again, because they will. Then we fight again, Eleanor said simply, for as long as we have to. When they arrived back at the plantation, word of the hearing's outcome had somehow already spread. The household staff was subdued, but Eleanor could see relief in their eyes. In the quarters, she glimpsed people standing in doorways, watching the carriage pass. That evening, Moses approached the big house. It was unusual. The workers generally avoided the main house unless specifically summoned. But Moses walked up the front steps and knocked on the door as if he had every right to be there, which Eleanor supposed he did. She met him on the porch. Moses, what can I do for you? Heard about the hearing, Moses said. Heard you won. For now, Moses agreed. He studied her face for a moment. I wanted to tell you something, ma'am. Something I've been thinking about since all this started. Eleanor waited. When you first came to the quarters and told us things were going to change, I didn't believe you. Thought you were playing some kind of game. White folks always got games, and black folks always lose. That's understandable, Eleanor said quietly. But you kept your word, month after month. The trust accounts, the better food, the repairs, all of it. You kept your word. Moses's voice was rough with emotion. Do you know how rare that is? How rare it is for someone with power over us to see us as people and not property. It should be normal, Eleanor said. It should be the baseline. Should be and is are two different things. Moses looked out toward the fields, toward the quarters, toward the life he'd been forced to live. What you've done here, it's not freedom, it's not justice, but it's something. It's a crack in the wall. And maybe someday that crack will be wide enough that the whole thing comes down. I hope so, Eleanor said. God, I hope so. Moses nodded and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. That baby of Ruth's, the one with the master's eyes? Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Yes, his name is Samuel. She finally felt safe enough to name him. Moses smiled slightly. Thought you should know. After he left, Eleanor stood alone on the porch as darkness fell. Samuel. The baby had a name now. A name meant identity, meant personhood, meant hope. It was such a small thing. A name. But in a world that tried to reduce people to numbers in a ledger, it was everything. Thomas joined her on the porch, 2 glasses of whiskey in his hands. He offered her one and she took it, surprised. They'd never drunk together before. It would have been improper, unfeminine. But so many things that had once been forbidden now seemed absurd. To cracks in walls, Thomas said, raising his glass. Eleanor clinked hers against his. To cracks in walls. They drank in silence, watching the stars come out over the Lowcountry. Somewhere in the quarters, Samuel was probably sleeping in his mother's arms, safe for the moment in a world that would try its best to break him. Somewhere in Charleston, men were probably still muttering about the McAllister scandal, about natural order disrupted. But here, on this plantation in the middle of nowhere, something different was taking root. Not revolution. Eleanor had no illusions about that. Not even real change, not in the way that mattered most, but a possibility, a glimpse of what could be if enough people were brave enough to reach for it. Years later, long after Eleanor and Thomas McAllister were both dead and buried, people still talked about them. Not in Charleston's drawing rooms. Those conversations faded quickly, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip. But in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the places where enslaved people gathered and shared their stories, they talked about the lady who made her husband work the fields, about the woman who looked at a system designed to break people and decided to bend it instead. About trust accounts that accumulated penny by penny until the day freedom finally came, and that money could be claimed. They talked about Samuel, Ruth's son with the grey-blue eyes, who used money from his trust account to buy land after emancipation, who built a school for black children on that land, teaching them to read and write and believe in their own worth. They talked about Moses, who lived to see freedom and used his trust funds to help other freed people establish themselves, who told everyone who would listen about the summer when things changed, when hope crept back into a place where it had been beaten out long ago. And they talked about Eleanor McAllister herself, the ghost who still walked those fields on humid nights. They said you could hear her voice on the wind, cool and steady and unafraid. Now he knows what it feels like to be owned. But that wasn't what Eleanor was really saying, the old folks would tell their grandchildren. What she was really saying, what her whole life was really saying, was something else. I know what it feels like to be free, and once you knew that, once you'd tasted even a sip of freedom, you could never forget. You carried it with you like a seed, waiting for the right moment to plant it, to water it, to watch it grow. The McAllister fortune eventually crumbled, just like the whispers in Charleston had predicted. The big house fell into disrepair and was eventually abandoned. The fields were reclaimed by forest and marsh. The physical evidence of their existence faded, but the story remained. Passed down through generations, changed and embellished with each telling until it was more legend than history. The plantation lady who made her husband work the fields, the revenge that shattered the McAllisters. Except it wasn't really about revenge, the wisest of the old folks would say. It was about something bigger, About a woman who looked at the world she'd been given, a world built on cruelty and inequality and the systematic destruction of human dignity, and decided to build something different within it, not perfect, not just, but different, and sometimes different was enough to change everything. On humid Carolina nights, when the wind crosses the old fields where the McAllister plantation used to stand, locals say you can still hear two voices. One is Eleanor's, cool and steady. Now he knows what it feels like to be owned, but if you listen closely, there's another voice too. Rough and worn, but filled with something that might be understanding, might be remorse, might be the beginning of redemption. And now I understand what it means to be human. The ghosts of Eleanor and Thomas McAllister walk those fields together, neither condemned nor forgiven, simply remembered. Two people who broke each other down and tried to build something better from the pieces, who failed in many ways but succeeded in one crucial thing. They changed. And that change, imperfect and incomplete as it was, rippled outward through time. It whispered to other women trapped in impossible situations, "You can fight back." It whispered to other men drunk on power, "You can be better." It whispered to everyone who would listen, "The world as it is does not have to be the world as it will be." The McAllister name faded from the Charleston social register. The plantation crumbled into ruins. The family line ended without heir or legacy. But the story survived. And in a world built on forgetting, on erasing the voices of those who dared to challenge the system, sometimes survival is the ultimate victory. The Lowcountry night is soft and full of secrets. The marsh grasses whisper their ancient songs. The Spanish moss sways in trees that have seen centuries come and go. And if you stand very still in the place where the McAllister plantation once stood, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you might hear it, the sound of a woman finding her voice, the sound of a man learning to be human, the sound of 53 people daring to hope, the sound of change, slow and painful and incomplete, but real nonetheless. And underneath it all, steady as a heartbeat, the truth that Eleanor McAllister learned in her rose garden that humid summer day. Some things, once broken, can never be put back together the same way. But sometimes that's exactly the point.